Happy heresies, yes, and welcome to the desert of the real. Welcome to the latest episode of the very nascent The Abraxas Brief. So glad you've joined us. Actually, there's people not joining yet from the Inner Sanctum of Gnosis Facebook group, but I'm sure they'll just be piling in at any moment. Actually, my wife is said she would watch this event. Hi, Serafina. No, I am not at a church event. I'm actually doing something very blasphemous here in the room, but now you can watch. So anyway, for this episode, I thought we would discuss the an origin of Gnosticism. I want to take an extra show, perhaps down the line, to talk about the exact how Gnosticism, as we know, formed in the first, second, third century, perhaps before. But I think I'd like to address an overlooked origin of Gnosticism. Most people always assume that the Gnostics had a Zoroastrian or a Jewish or perhaps a Christian origin. And of course, there was the famous quote by Adolf von Harnack that said that Gnosticism was the acute Hellenization of Christianity, that basically it was a Platonic Greek religion that heavily influenced Gnosticism. But it must be said that often I feel the Egyptian origins of Gnosticism are overlooked, and how impactful they were, how important were, and perhaps could be the main origin of Gnosticism. That's certainly an argument that could be made. So I wanted to address that on this The Abraxas Brief, and talk about a few other things that dealing with perfection, and you'll see how it ties in. And it's also interesting too. It reminds me of I remember a couple of years ago at MythCon for Mythicist Milwaukee. We had the Bart Ehrman Robert Price debate. And it was a great event. The guys at Mythicist Milwaukee always put on great events, and it was a fascinating debate. But at one point, Robert Price was talking about the origins of Gnosticism, and Bart sort of interrupted him and said, Bob, in the old days, everybody thought about the Egyptian and Zoroastrian origins of Gnosticism. That's out the door. Now, these days, it's basically that Gnosticism just sort of came out like a tumor out of Christianity and so forth. And the argument sort of didn't get addressed for various reasons. But then later on, Bob came on the show and he clarified that. And you can find how Bob clarifies and addresses Bart Ehrman's argument. And I believe the show is the Finding the Demiurge in the Bible. And you can just Google it on YouTube or let me know. I can get you a link. But Bob gives his arguments about the Egyptian origins of Gnosticism. And I think, yes, I think Bart Ehrman is right. It sort of went that way where Gnosticism was just a tuma coming out of Christianity. But I think now it's going back and we're getting into more of the granular origins of Gnosticism, which is Egypt. And so anyway, how did this happen? Well, of course, I'd like to show a very important book that I do like to show. And any of the books that I show tonight, again, I'll put them in the show notes. I would highly recommend you get them because I feel they're very insightful and they've definitely informed me. So my argument comes partially from April DeConnick's great book, The Gnostic New Age. It is really the latest and great work on the Gnostics, and she ties it all the different theories, and she really crystallizes what the Gnostics were, their origins, and anyway, it's groundbreaking, and it summarizes very well the latest scholarship on Gnosticism. But I'm not starting to say that with like a Midwestern accent. Gnosticism. Anyway, so what is April's argument? Well, her argument is this. Once upon a time, probably in the first century BCE, perhaps earlier, perhaps later, there were some very dissatisfied Jews and Greeks, perhaps, or maybe Hellenized Jews. And they were done with the temple culture and, of course, the rise of the Roman Empire and so forth. And they basically made their way to Alexandria, the great city in Africa. What they found there was, and this is what April calls them, they found these gurus. And these gurus they were carrying the really ancient mystery Egyptian religion. They were the ones who were still holding on. I mean, at the time, around the first century BCE, you already had the Ptolemy dynasty, basically bringing in new gods, taking away old gods, and of course you had the Romans and their flooding of their own gods and whatever. So some of the really primordial Egyptian myths and rituals and all that were washed away, except for these gurus. So these Jews or these Greeks, they started learning from these gurus, these sort of, I don't know, Tony Robbins or Deepak Chopras of the ancient Egypt. And they learned these ancient mysteries, and they were passed on. So as April says, basically the Hermetics and the Gnostics were the direct carriers of this ancient Egyptian Gnosis. And well, what's the evidence for that? I guess, well, before we get into the evidence, we really have to get into the Gnostic myth. As some of you know, when we look at works like the Secret Book of John and maybe the Valentinian myths, some of them, it's how do they start? Well, it usually starts with there is a primordial consciousness, or there's simple being. That's all there is. At one point, being suddenly becomes aware. This perfection, I mean, I think the Sethians called it the invisible spirits. The invisible spirit, the Valentinians, was depth. Became aware, and to become aware, it found itself with a curiosity to know itself. I guess it had gnosis, right? So this being, the invisible spirit, as soon as it wanted to know itself, it split into a duality. And that duality became, you might say, his or its consort. It was basically, here I am being and I am becoming, and there is a reflection, or there is something that can receive my knowledge and put it back to me. So you had this duality. The Sethians called her Barbelo, the Supreme Mother. The Valentinians called her Silence. And there were other names for her. And suddenly there's this interplay between the being and the becoming, or they're both becoming. And the interplay is very interesting. In the Secret Book of John, it's almost like it's almost like the being, the invisible spirit, is having sex. He wants to know himself, and he just drills right into Barbelo, and she just comes back and gives birth to a realization of what he is: mind, goodness, perfection, and so forth. And a whole bunch of, and basically the interplay of these two creates the aeons, the attributes of the supreme mind or the supreme consciousness, and they start to spread out with this interplay as they're kind of copulating by interacting with each other with information. And yes, and there's many. There's again, there's mind, there's love, and eventually it comes down to the last aeon that is created, called Sophia, the wisdom of God. But that's another story. So this is basically, you might say, the primordial Gnostic myth. And as April says, this isn't found in any other religion. I mean, if you look at Plato, that's not exactly, or Neoplatonism, and that's not exactly how existence came to being. It's always there, and it's always eternal. So you can sort of take out the Plato right there to an extent. I mean, April does say in the 2nd century, the Gnostics then started really adopting Plato and so forth and solidifying their myths. But the early Gnostic myths, again, are very different. Sort of this emanation into being through copulation. through basically it's almost like a gigantic love story, and a love story about knowing who you are and expanding as much as you can. Of course, in some of the Gnostic myths, this love story ends up bad because the wisdom of God decides to rebel as she doesn't want to conform with the natural order. She wants to know. She's wisdom, so therefore she's going to know, and she's going to experience at any cost. She's just doing what her nature is, and that causes the big mess, and she falls from the eternal realm of the aeons and the mind of God. The aeons basically goes crazy, and here we are in this world. So that's the Gnostic myth in essence. So again, you don't find this in Greek mythology or Plato. Certainly don't find it in Judaism. You don't find it in the Zoroastrian stories. To an extent, maybe some later ones after Christianity. So where do you find this? What is pretty original? Well, it's not. Again, let's look at all those Egyptian gurus running around Alexandria. We do find it in very primordial Egyptian myths, probably about 4,000 years ago, the coffin text. And this is basically the myth of the great god above God, Atum, A-T-U-M. In this myth, well, it's kind of the same. You've got Atum, who's just sitting in the void, and suddenly he becomes aware. Not only does he become aware, but when he becomes aware, he realizes he's a giant serpent. And Atum, of course, feels loneliness because he wants to know, well, who am I? What's going on here? How do I get to know each other? Well, it's a bit different than that of Barbelo and the Visual Spirit and their little romance. Because what happens, Atum has his tail is a penis and his mouth is a womb. So he basically inseminates his own mouth. He basically, I'm not going to use a bad word, F's his own mouth, if you would. Which I wish more people would do that today, right? But he copulates with his own mouth, inseminates his mouth, and becomes pregnant. And he begins to spit out the major gods of the Egyptian pantheon. And of course, these gods are 8. They're called the Ogdoad. And very similarly, in older Gnostic myths, you've got the Ogdoad, the primordial, or I keep saying primordial, the main aeons that constitute the mind of God. So Atum, that myth definitely was borrowed by the Gnostics, and it's definitely an Egyptian stream. And and yes, I think as some of you know, Atum putting his thing in his mouth is actually, guess what? It's an ancient Ouroboros, and that's how probably it started. I mean, the Ouroboros certainly is an ancient Egyptian iconography. We know it in the 3rd century from the drawing of Cleopatra, the alchemist, but we also know that the Gnostics and the Hermetics adopted this symbol. It was very important to it. Yes, so the Gnostics and Hermetics appropriated from the Egyptians, and then these days neo-pagans and occultists although appropriated the symbol for their own use in modern occultism. Also as well, we know that in the 4th century, the Pistis Sophia, the Gnostic gospel, talks about the Ouroboros, but it puts it more as this giant snake or dragon that swallows its tail, and basically it's more like this wheel of karma keeping all of the sparks inside of it. Obviously, Atum is more of a benign being. He is being, but he is also becoming. Through him, everything becomes. And it is said in the myths that one day when Atum has had enough of the whole experience of getting to know himself, he'll just simply close his eyes and everything will just stop, and everything will become dark and blank as it once was, and there will only be being. In other myths, you have Atum becomes very angry, and he begins to cry, and his tears turn into humanity. Again, this seems to be like a prevalent myth. It's always like humanity is some mistake or comes out of some anger or something like that. It makes you wonder with all these myths, maybe Agent Smith is right and we don't we shouldn't even be here. We are a virus, because sometimes we humans are the perennial tricksters in every myth, or the perennial mistakes, or so forth. So that's an interesting thing. So again, we have the myth of a tomb, which is very original, that eventually became part of the Gnostic theology. And yes, of course, I mean, as many of you know, Plato and Pythagoras went to Egypt, because after all, Egypt was the place where you really learned about the nature of consciousness and the nature of the cosmos. That's where you went. It was like the place to be initiated. It was the Harvard of those days, you might say. In fact, Atum also is referred to in the coffin text as the one who is always becoming. So he is becoming, and he is always there. He is what sustains all of us with this, again, ability to want to know himself. What are other similarities beyond the myth? Well, that's interesting. I think obviously there was some ancient Egyptians were into the sacred sex magic, the Gnostics of Alexandria with the Carpocratians and the Barbellites and so forth, certainly adopted the sex magic, and there's some strange myths where Barbello is just a sensual goddess who is able to tempt the archons and make them spill out their juices and part of the light substance they stole from the eternal realm. But that's another story. But anyway, that's another similarity. I think it's interesting if you read Lawrence Caruana's great book, Sacred Codes, he was on a few months ago. He has a part where you have Egyptian texts from like the 3rd BCE. And when the dead go, it's not like they just go to the Hall of the Dead and the feather and weigh this and all that great stuff. No, it's there's actually, again, this voyage through the heavens, and there are passwords you have to know, and there is knowledge you need to know, and you have to go through these very negative gatekeepers that can really, well, screw you up. And again, that's right out of the Gnostic playbook, the idea that we always have to travel these different dimensions and deal with the gatekeepers who are the archons, and we need to know the passwords and the right incantations to say to get through them, so we can eventually get to the fullness of the divine, or what the Gnostics call the pleroma. So there's definitely 3 similarities. Obviously, I could go longer, but I would certainly get April's book, because it is chock full of more of this information and insights about the Gnostics, and certainly insights that I would have enjoyed if Robert Price and Bart Ehrman would have included these and gone a little longer in the debate at MythCon. What else? I think... So why did I put the title about the iniquity of perfection? Well, that's an interesting one. I wanted to bring in. Again, I'm just trying to what people email me and some insights that I've had. I'm going to get a drink first. Salud. Yeah, my e-cigarette. How you guys doing at the thing? Everybody awake? Good job. Good job. So anyway, perfection. It was a few years ago, one of the college professor told me something very interesting. He told me that the greatest evil in the world, it wasn't Hitler, it wasn't Taylor Swift, it wasn't Genghis Khan or anything like that, or the Black Plague, but the greatest evil in the world was Plato. Why? And I asked him why. Well, because Plato either introduced or discovered this notion called perfection. You mentioned SpongeBob doing perfection. And what that did is that really messed up Western society, because before, with pagan cultures and so forth, there was no perfection. Everything was flowing. Again, look at Atum, or the invisible spirit of the Gnostics. Everything simply was becoming. And becoming in itself is the perfection, whether it's Sophia's mistakes or the romance of Barbelo. Once Plato brought in perfection. This professor who told me was a philosophy professor, a very brilliant guy. It still is a very brilliant guy. I don't talk to him that much. I don't know. But he did say once perfection was there, it really raised the bar of what the universe was, what the gods were, what everything was. It's something we had to escalate this giant ladder to reach this perfection, this idealized state, when before in paganism or even Judaism, everything was always becoming, everything was in a state of flux, nothing lived forever, and everything was eternal in the way that everything was cyclical. So once Plato came in, it really messed up the consciousness and the psyche of Western thought, and that was a great damage. Suddenly we got to be perfect like our Father in heaven, or perfect like the Virgin Mary, or suddenly we got to elevate Yahweh to this perfection, and he becomes the philosopher's God, everything, this sort of static, frozen place, and the place of being, the static place of being, when instead of being a place of what the ancient world knew, probably including the Gnostics, the place of being, of where being itself is perfection and things are always continuing. So that's interesting. And I always thought, well, maybe too. I mean, when you looked again towards the Gnostic myths, yes, there is that state of being, that static state of perfection. But then when the being's going, when being suddenly becomes becoming, then everything isn't so perfect. I mean, the mind of the supreme God, the invisible spirit and his aliens, there's nothing about omniscience. There's nothing about omnipotence. There's nothing of these sort of perfect analogies. Yes, there is an aeon of perfection, but that's because there is a harmony with the aeons just flowing out. So again, that's sort of a knock on thinking that the Gnostics were ever Platonic. I think, again, they were really more part of the ancient vibe. So I think, and it's a great lesson, because I think you should not worry about being perfection. I think we're all programmed to think that there's some idealized place, that there is this place of pure perfection and we can reach it, and if we just try and so forth. But I think we've raised the bar. I think the best thing we can do is to simply become and continue becoming, just like Atum, just like the invisible spirit out there. And it's a great lesson. So that's what I really wanted to talk about when it comes to perfection. I mean, in an interview not too long ago, we had Robert Bonomo. I always enjoy having him at the show. He was discussing his movie, The 21 Faces of God. And I asked him, well, what's the meaning of life? And he said, well, the purpose of life is to become more aware. I think that's a brilliant one. And it goes right back to Atum, or the invisible spirit. We become aware, and we have to go on a journey of self-understanding, of self-knowledge. And as we become more aware, we gain more insights. Our consciousness expand, and we see our perspective begins to learn new things. At the same time, I'm sure even in the Gnostic myths, as there are new aeons created, there are new questions. I mean, they begin to split in different places and create their own little kingdoms. And that's what happens to us. The more aware we are, the more answers we get. The kind of silly the answers or the questions might have been, but probably deeper questions appear as we break on through new horizons and new vistas and continually expand. And perhaps there is no ending. Perhaps there is, we just continue to become aware, and we continue to find new insights. So that's my little insight on that one, and how it ties into the Gnostics and the Egyptian origins of Gnosticism. So, and again, don't worry too much about perfection. I mean, it's kind of like, it becomes kind of like Nigel in Spinal Tap, when he's looking at that perfect guitar. Don't even look at it. Just walk away. And that's not, we can't be that way, because that stifles knowledge, that stifles awareness, and that stifles our becoming into where we need to become. Until, again, maybe one day Atum just decided he's just going to pull the plug and we go right into being. and then we'll be perfect. But then it won't matter because there won't be any individuation at all. We'll all just be one. So with that, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Abraxas Brief. I hope it's been insightful. Again, if you can, please support so I can continue bringing not just the Abraxas Brief, but the podcast, some videos that I'm making, and really keep this heresy going. Of course, email me the topics you want to know, questions that I might answer, and I really hope that I've been of some service to you, oh you true seeker warriors. So now I will stop it for the audience at the inner sanctum of Gnosis. I would like to take your questions, and this will be placed in again on the Facebook group, and as well as for patrons and in members. I have a page now where the videos, the entire videos of the Abraxas Brief are now placed. So check it out. And for the rest of you, well, please write your own gospel and live your own myth, just like the ancient Egyptians did. Oh, those gurus.